Hi. After the last session where we only had to look at 2.5 verses from 14:8b to 11, but it took 28 minutes to do it because the issues were so challenging with the themes of wrath and anger and fornication that you may be glad to know if you watch through that one that this one should be much shorter and much more simple. And I still have verse 10 up there on the left side of the screen because there's a couple of things I didn't get to last time that I would like to start with here. One of the elements of de Villiers' close-up look at the chiastic structure, and here's his piece if you haven't seen that before, and here's the chiastic structure that I've adapted from it, from his work. Here's the top of it that I've been working on, is he looks closely enough to see things that are impossible for English language readers to note. For example, this first part of verse 10, they will also drink the wine of God's wrath, etc. Here's what it looks like in Greek, or at least in transliterated Greek. And if you can't read this or pronounce it directly, you can at least see that the oo sounds at the end are 10 times. So it rhymes consistently throughout that, and there's also alliteration there. So one of the ways that John is getting his audience to be drawn into his message is through the very sound of it. And that shouldn't surprise us too much because the book has been very auditory, whether that's the sound of kitharas or the sound of many waters or thunder, as we've seen. It shouldn't surprise us too much that the sound of the words themselves is part of what John is trying to use to convey his message. The other thing I didn't get to here was in verse 11, no rest day or night for those who worship the beast. And that's a good segue to where we're going today, where those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus do rest from their labors. So that's another one of those contrasts that we've been looking at before, as I showed in the last couple of videos, the contrast between chapter 13 and 14, where chapter 13 showed the beast reigning and people worshiping them, and now we see some of the consequences and the alternative of that in chapter 14. So at the end of the last video, I jumped ahead to suggest we'd be looking at this section, this section down here with the next set of 3 angels, but I forgot that we hadn't looked at the very center of the chiasm here, which is what we're going to look at today, 4:12 to 14, this encouragement to the saints, which is at the center of the chiasm. And as we do, we'll note there are a number of things that are interesting in these 3 verses here as I move down to get those on the screen for us, 12 to 14. First, there's several things that are repeated elsewhere. Let's look at that here. So it begins with this phrase, here's a call for in the NORSV, endurance or the faithful resistance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God, and in the NORSV hold fast to the faith of Jesus. We'll look at the translation issues in a moment. But here we can see how this is exactly parallel to what we saw in 13:10 with a slight difference. And there are also these other parallels in these couple of verses, both backward and forward. So John is beginning to repeat himself. Partly that's a structural element, and partly it's an educational element. As every marketing person knows that the more times you say it, the more likely it is that people can hear it. So he's beginning to repeat himself as he spirals toward the judgment scenes and the revealing of New Jerusalem, which will follow that at the end. We don't need to look back here at hupomene, which we've seen before, but I do note this is the last use of it in Revelation, and I just noted it frames that there. There's an interesting question here about how this should be translated. What the relationship is between this phrase, this clause after the comma, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus, with the beginning, here's a call for the endurance of the saints. And note in my note below, here are a couple of possible other translations that indicate the ambiguity of it. So from the contemporary English we hear, God's people must learn to endure, period. They must also obey his commandments and have faith in Jesus. So they are both 2 separate statements, and both are calls to obedience. But in the Good News version, it's the other way around. Here is the patience of Jesus. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. So from that perspective, it's a matter of witness. If you want to see what it looks like, well, look at the saints, the holy ones, which is not a technical term as it later became, especially in the Catholic Church, for individuals who've been selected for official sainthood, but as Paul uses it for those who are part of the discipleship community. So it's ambiguous here whether this is a call to them to keep the commandments and to hold to the faith of Jesus, or whether that's a defining factor. The saints are those who do that, and they should therefore practice hupomene, or whether it's a witness. This is what it looks like. These are the people who keep the commandments of God and hold to the faith of Jesus. It can be read any of those ways. There's actually only one verb for the second part, and tereo is not it. Tereo is the verb for to keep, but that's not what's said here. It's literally those keeping. So here's a call for the hupomene of the saints, those keeping the commandments of God and faith in Jesus, because as my note here says, there's no extra verb here, and many translations have it differently. And the challenge in the second part is it the faith of Jesus or faith in Jesus? The genitive form here, and the technical Greek ten piston Jesu, also comes out as an issue in Romans, and I won't go to that. Piston, curiously, the substantive for faith, as opposed to the verb pistuo, is only a couple of other places in Revelation you can see. And as my note here says, translations are evenly divided of whether it's holding to the faith of Jesus, in other words, sharing the same kind of faith in God that Jesus has, or having faith in Jesus directly, that one's trust is in Jesus himself. And that's ambiguous, and I don't see a clear way to answer that, and maybe it's a both and not an either or. But those two elements there, notice it's the commandments of God, not commandments of Jesus. As I've been trying to underscore throughout this, there's nothing here about starting a new religion called Christianity, and certainly nothing about a different God than the God that Jesus embodies from the Hebrew Scripture. As we saw earlier in this chapter, the eternal gospel is simply to trust in the Creator God. And so here, to keep the commandments of God, there are no new commandments, and to trust the way Jesus trusted, or to trust in Jesus directly. And then he heard a voice from heaven, and this is the only voice that's not identified. You notice from our structure here, there were the three angels in the B part of the chiasm, and the other three angels in the second part, and now there's this unidentified voice from heaven. We've seen unidentified voices from heaven before, but that's a curious thing here, that after the sequence of another angel, another angel, another angel, is simply this unidentified voice. And the voice tells John to write. And that's not a common thing throughout, even though, ironically, the whole thing is being written, not just the things that are said to write. And one can play with the meta aspects of that if you want. Note that the uses of write earlier are all in the messages to the ecclesiae, to the churches, until we get to 10:4, which is where he hears the sound of thunders and is told, don't write. And so this is really the first time outside the messages where John is told to write. Let's look at the last two just so we can see what this is paired with. So the angel says to John, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb, a passage we'll return to in just a minute. And then finally here in 21:5, write this, for these words are trustworthy and true. And so it's when the voice from heaven says to write this, that's certainly an emphasizing that there's something really important going on here. And what he says is, blessed are the dead who from now on die in the Lord. And we realize that this is, of course, a beatitude, just like in Matthew or in Luke, where there are beatitudes using the Greek makarios singular or makarii plural, as you see here. It should not surprise you to know, guess how many the beatitudes there are in Revelation? Yes, there are 7. And they don't form a chiasm exactly. I've paired them here, as scholars have done, to show which ones are related to each other. So the first one at the very beginning and the sixth one both have to do with being blessed for keeping the words of the prophecy in the book. But the one we're on now, the second one, matches not with what would be a chiastic parallel, which would be, well, it does if you just look at these 5, but the purple ones aren't, about what happens when you die. So die in the Lord, share in the first resurrection. But the purple ones are paired here and plainly don't follow a chiastic structure about clothing, metaphorically about clothing. At the very center there, even if it's not a chiasm, this is clearly at the center. Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb, which will lead to the exciting conclusion of the book. So blessed are the dead, and curiously, this is also something that's not used that much, again in the messages to the churches, but only a few times here. Death is referred to, and dying and killing, but the dead as a category is curiously not that frequent. And they're referred to, blessed are the dead who from now on, op arti, and scholars argue about whether this is 2 words, as I show it here, or a singular word, which would mean certainly rather than from now on. But either way, die in the Lord, which is a frequent term in Paul and Curio, but rare elsewhere, in fact, only here elsewhere, as Auni points out. So it's a number of things we're seeing in this verse and the next verse that are common elsewhere in Scripture or in the New Testament that are rare in Revelation. So this phrase, in the Lord. And similarly, yes, says the Spirit. This is the only action of the Spirit in the entire book, even though the word pneuma for Spirit is used 24 times. So why John is referring here suddenly to a response from the Spirit as opposed to a response from the altar, which we hear in one of the other interjections of the Greek nigh here, the altar replying in 16:7, or the one who testifies replying in 22:20. So why it's the Spirit, don't know, but what the Spirit says is they will rest from their labors, using the sabbatical word, the Sabbath word, echoing from the very last verse of the book of Daniel. The righteous man, though he die early, will be at rest, is also from wisdom. So there is the late wisdom tradition, the apocalyptic tradition, expressing some kind of hope for rest after death. I can't underscore too many times, this is not about a soul going to heaven. This is about dead people resting from their labors and then experiencing resurrection, as we'll see later in the story, consistent with the Gospels and Paul and all the New Testament literature. That the hope is not that a soul will go to be with God, but that bodies will come out of the tombs and be given a new form and will live again on earth as in heaven. So they will rest from their labors. Kopon here for labors, only one other time in Revelation. Notice that labor and harvest are also associated in John's Gospel. There he uses a different word for labor in that context. Their deeds will follow them. Their works here, 20 times in Revelation, also something we hear from the apocalyptic text of 4th Ezra. So by this time there was already a developed Jewish tradition that people who died faithfully will be judged by how they lived their life and will be rewarded in the afterlife, and 1st Enoch is also a witness to that. And then we get to our last verse and the key of this section here, and the beginning of 14 to 20 here, as we'll look at next time, the paired harvest scenes. So then he looked, and this is reversing what we've seen earlier, where he looked, he heard something from the tradition, but when he looked, he saw reality. Here, he heard a voice from heaven saying this, but when he looked, he saw something very different. Whether these are commenting on each other or not isn't obvious. But you can read that way if you like, that what's being interpreted here is why those are blessed who die from now on in the Lord is because this one like a human being is coming. But the link isn't obvious plainly. So there is kaidu, the constant term for and behold. So the RSV tones down the attention word there. And curiously, this is the only mention of a white cloud in the entire Bible. Maybe because clouds are so obviously white most of the time, but I live in the Pacific Northwest where clouds can easily be many shades of gray as well, and maybe you do too, live in places where clouds aren't just white. It's not clear why it's specifically white, but there it is. But the word for cloud is common. In fact, guess what? 7 times in Revelation, 4 times in this section. And the image of a cloud with one like a human being is plainly from Daniel 7:13, but also from 4th Ezra, and I'll put the quote up on the screen so you can see it fully here. I'm not going to read that to you. You can see it for yourself. I would note that 1st Enoch mentions a human being, one like a human being or son of man many times, but never pictured on a cloud, but pictured on the throne, as we saw earlier. And that underscores the fact that although human one or son of man is one of the most common apocalyptic terms for someone who's in relationship with God, who's going to express judgment, again from 4th Ezra and 1st Enoch, and earlier than that from the book of Daniel, it's only in Revelation this and one other time. And in fact, if it wasn't in 1:13, we wouldn't be at all clear that this referred to Jesus, because the is simply wrong here. There is no article in the Greek. It's anarthros. It's I saw one like a human being, which is exactly what it is from Daniel. It's almost a verbatim quote, other than the fact that there it's not seated on the cloud, it's they're coming with the clouds. So seeing one like a human being does not necessarily mean the eschatological agent of God's judgment, but simply could be a human being, as in contrast with an angel or in contrast with a beast or something like that. But given 1:13, which I'll go back to for a moment, this is plainly referring to the one that Revelation otherwise refers to as the Lamb. Because in the midst of the lampstands, I saw one like this human being, and that's the one who's then in power, as we see following. So we know from 1:13 that this one isn't just a human being, but is the same Lamb who's been seen with God on the throne all along. And in this case, he's wearing this golden crown, which we last saw in the Agents of the Beast in 9:7, but we saw in 4:4 with the 24 elders around the throne who cast their golden crowns before the throne, indicating they were submissive to the power of God on the throne. But the human one here is not submissive to the power on the throne, but has his own power. And he also has a sharp sickle. And we'll get to the details of the sickle and the echoes from Joel 3:13 here when we look at the harvest in the next scene. But I just want to notice a couple quick things about this. Both the word sharp, aku, and the word sickle here, depranon, are used, guess what, 7 times each in Revelation. And notice what John has done. All the uses of sickle are in this section, but they can't all be described as sharp because sharp is used to describe a couple of other things like swords elsewhere. So to make it work, assuming that's what John is doing, only 5 times here is the sickle called sharp, so that he can use the word sharp other times. And I haven't pointed out every time a Greek word is used 7 times in Revelation, but it's a lot of times, and it indicates the care with which John composed this story. So that really gets us to the end of our scene for today, and we'll pick up next time. Whether I can get through all of this in one time, probably not. We'll probably just do the harvest of the saints next time and the harvest of evildoers the time after that. See you then. Bye-bye.